They told me love fixed everything. The truth was uglier. Sometimes love becomes a house with thin walls and the people inside keep closing doors without noticing the cracks. If someone has ever given you pain, or happiness in your life, share it in the comments below. I'd love to hear your story. My name is Lila Hart. I married Ethan Reeves when I was 28, in a backyard wedding drenched with fairy lights and promises. He was the kind of man who still texted me pictures of coffee he made for me on weekday mornings. He called me Lil, like we shared a secret language. Our life was quiet, reliable, ordinary in a way that felt like safety. Vivian came with him. I remember the first small thing. It was a casserole dish at my parents' dinner. Vivian arrived with an enormous smile and a casserole wrapped in newspaper. "Oh, Lila, sweetie," she said, the words too warm. "I made a little something. I remember when Ethan loved casseroles. Do you remember, honey?" She patted Ethan's arm like she was an actress announcing her best scene. Smiled. Thanked her. Inside, a thin flint of something flared. Was she being kind? Or was she establishing a rhythm where she was the benevolent conductor and I was a peripheral note? It didn't matter then. No one ever accused her of being cruel. She gave gifts, she volunteered for family committees, she laughed easily in the right places. But her kindness was always a conditional kindness. A compliment layered with a barb, an offer that came with strings. When Ethan praised my job, "She's starting at a great new firm next month," Vivian would clap slowly, then say, "Oh, it's such a pity she'll miss so much time being the perfect wife." Everyone laughed. I forced a laugh that tasted like pennies. These were phrase, tiny, almost tender little cuts. But they appeared every time I opened my mouth, every time I tried to be ours rather than hers. The house hummed with ordinary noises, and under that there was a low, constant hum of disapproval like a radio left on low. I tried to shrink at first. I thought if I became smaller it would fit. I wore neutral colors at holidays. I let Vivian make plans and I smiled. Most nights I went to bed thinking of a different life we might have, one without the careful sculpting of my limitations by someone who thought she owned more than memories. The thing about emotional erosion is that it's quieter than you expect. It seeps in during ordinary moments. A text left unreplied to that's later told as forgetfulness. An offhand comment about how a good wife would never travel for work. I felt the threads pull, but I kept sewing. It became a pattern. Vivian's tiny victories stacked like money in a drawer until they became a measured fortune. At Thanksgiving, she insisted on hosting, then rearranged the seating so that Ethan sat between her and his sister, what she called to keep the conversation flowing. At Christmas, she bought Ethan an expensive watch and made a grand toast about family tradition while she lifted her glass and said, "It's a shame some people prefer novelty over duty." She looked at me. The room waited for me to respond. I laughed. Ethan didn't. Never once did she raise her voice. Never once did she slap a hand on a table. Her greatest weapon was the ability to make everyone believe she was the moral center. And if you questioned her, you were the one who seemed ungrateful. Ethan began to change in ways I would only identify later. He stopped defending me in the small skirmishes. When she said, "I can't believe you'd let Lila," he used to say, "She's been working overtime, Viv, cut her some slack." But then his sentences shortened. He took fewer calls at night. He'd stand between us like a person who'd been trained in being neutral. Someone who understood that taking a side might hurt the wrong person. The quiet war is the most violent. Vivian didn't need to win every argument. She needed to be the steady hand that rewired the house. She rewired people. She made Ethan stand at the center of a web where she was the hub. I noticed the way his jaw flexed when she spoke, the tiny nods he offered that were more comfort than resistance. He loved me. He loved me in a way that was true. But love alone can be a soft shield in a world where someone else sharpens their words like knives. And each time I pressed the bleeding edges, I felt the house siding shift. There was an incident with a charity event that taught me the shape of her power. We had volunteered to co-host a neighborhood fundraiser. I spent weeks planning the program, calling donors, and rehearsing the speech I would give. A clean, brave little speech about moving forward. The night before, Vivian offered to help me set the tables. Her help looked more like rearranging the guest list. The night of the event, she made a warm introduction about me that glittered with just enough praise to sting, and then she leaned close to a reporter and whispered, "Lila is such a nice girl, bless her heart, but sometimes those bright lights, they can be too much for someone whose world is home." Her laugh as she spoke into the drink-splattered microphone sounded like a bell pealing. The article next morning called me, "The Wife Who Tried." Ethan read it and said, "You were amazing." But the way he said it felt like a bandage, not a cure. That was the first time I tasted the taste of a plan not made by me. I felt anger flare, sharp, clean, and then a colder, more patient thing settle in. I knew something that Vivian had not yet considered. Patience can be weaponized just as easily as malice. The breaking point was not a dramatic screaming match. It was small, surgical. It was a gift that came wrapped in a performance. Vivian loved moments. Public gestures that allowed her to be revered. My birthday arrived in November. Ethan had been carefully quiet about a present all week. We went to a family brunch where Vivian had already been anointed queen. She wore pearls and jokes in the same breath. She handed me a small box at the table, eyes wet with practiced feeling. "For Lila, who saves our family with her charm," she said. Inside was a locket. Beautiful but older-looking, sentimental. A family heirloom, one would assume. Ethan opened his mouth. Then hesitated, then closed it. Vivian said, "I thought it fitting. It was my mother's." She described in soft, soaked tones how the locket had been passed to her and how she wanted to give it to me because family must keep family. The room sighed. I was supposed to look moved. I was supposed to be grateful. I held the locket and felt something deep and old and animal rise in my chest. I remembered a summer when Vivian and I had shared tea and she told me with a laugh, "You'll never be as close as I am to my son. That's fine. You'll learn to accept his place." I smiled then, but now I wanted to actually say what it had felt like, to be crowned second place. Later that night, alone in our kitchen, I opened the locket fully. Inside was a photograph, yes, but it wasn't of Vivian's mother. It was a picture of a woman I'd never met, younger, fierce, and my stomach dropped as if I'd been pushed. A paper slip tucked behind the photo. Receipt. Name. Address. A small, almost silly thing. A name of a charity that Vivian had donated to in memory. Felt oddly dizzy. The next morning a friend from college called me. She'd been at brunch. She'd seen the locket and had mentioned that it looked like a reproduction she had recognized from an antique shop downtown. He sent me a link. My hands trembled. The heirloom had been made last season and sold at a boutique Vivian frequented. That was the moment I realized Vivian's currency was myth. She sold stories and expected gratitude. She'd crafted an object of sentiment and staged a performance around it. And the family had lapped it up like dessert. My world didn't explode. My heart did not rage into instant confrontation. Instead, a cold, animal logic moved in me. If she wanted to build a life on fictions, I would let her live inside them. I would not rip the stage down with a tantrum. I would wait until the performance collapsed under its own weight. I stopped speaking. That might sound dramatic, but it was a strategy. Where I once argued, where I once explained, I began to recede. Not because I was weak, but because fading gave me power Vivian could not recognize. At work, I told the partners I needed flexibility. I turned down social invitations for a while and said I was exhausted. At home, I went quiet at dinner, pulled back from family plans, and let Vivian orchestrate the gatherings. She beamed. She took my silence as victory. "She's overwhelmed," she told Ethan in passing. "We must handle things for her." Ethan would nod, relieved to be useful. This is the sad thing, when someone wants to be a savior, They hand you the tools of their control. While I vanished socially, I became a careful observer. I took notes on my phone, little bullet points hidden under the harmless label "to do." I kept a folder of messages where she contradicted herself. I saved images of receipts and screenshots of social posts where she praised certain values and privately disparaged them. I kept copies of emails that showed how she'd subtly redirected family business. I recorded voicemails where she apologized one way in front of me and complained another way behind my back. But I did more than collect proof. I started to arrange life in ways that would reveal contradictions without me seeming vengeful. I agreed to host a small celebration for Ethan's promotion, and then outsourced the guest list specifics to a family friend who'd always been neutral. I let Vivian take the lead publicly, while quietly ensuring the friend sat between her and several relatives who had their own quiet suspicions. I arranged my schedule so I was present, but unremarkable. To the people in the house, I looked like someone exiting the stage. To the people outside it, I looked like someone building a small arsenal. It's tempting to think revenge must be loud. The sort of justice I wanted wasn't a scream. It was a slow, certain unmasking. Let her think she'd won. Let the family look to her for answers and see them stumble. Let her patterns come together like constellations and be recognized for what they always were. Vivian's mask was blinding in its polish. What she didn't account for was how mirrors multiply. People started to notice small misalignments. A cousin remembered a birthday that wasn't the one she'd been told. A sister-in-law found an RSVP email where Vivian had suggested a guest be excluded for reasons of decorum, and later told the guest she'd been overlooked by accident. The more people I let see the edges, the more the edges began to fray. I never walked into a room and accused her. I planted questions like seeds. "Viv, did you mean to list Aunt Marlene as a +1? I'd ask in a casual tone, the sort of benign confusion that required no defense. Her answers came quick and practiced. "Oh, I must have made a mistake. Such a scatterbrain me." But the friend who'd been excluded raised her hand in a conversation and said, "No, actually, Viv told me later she thought it would be too awkward." Eyes turned subtle ways. People exchange glances. You can see suspicion grow like mold along baseboards once the water shows. My most effective move was letting Ethan witness contradictions without me being the interpreter. I stopped catching him before he absorbed an accusation or smoothed over a slight. Instead, I watched and waited for cognitive dissonance to do its work inside him. It's painful, orchestrating for your husband to see the truth, because for that truth to sting him, someone has to be wrong. But he's not a child. He's an adult who deserves to know what his mother was capable of. One evening, a family meeting about our garden renovation became the perfect stage. Vivian had told everyone she'd spoken to the landscaper, a friend, and said she had ideas. In front of the group, she described one plan as if she'd masterminded it. Later, in a private side conversation with Ethan, the landscaper casually mentioned, "Oh, I spoke to Lila about the shade we planted." Viv said she loved the idea. Ethan's brow furrowed. He turned to Vivian and said simply, "Who decided on the shade?" Vivian, caught in the offhand contradiction of different narratives, made a small, frantic joke. Landed wrong. The room shifted. Jokes are brittle things when used to cover a seam. They crack. Seams begin to talk. Once the family detected a pattern, repeated phrasing that matched Vivian's public persona and shrank in private, they began to dissent. It wasn't allegiance to me that spurred them. It was a human discomfort at being manipulated. People don't like being puppeteered. They like being trusted with the full picture. This part required precision. I knew I couldn't produce a grand courtroom-style reveal. That would not be in character. Instead, I built scenarios where Vivian's own reactive nature would betray her instincts and confessions. I started with small, harmless entrapments. A cousin, Sarah, complained about Vivian insisting she bring home an adopted pup that needed a calmer home. Sarah loved the pup, but told me later she'd overheard Vivian telling her friend on the phone, "She's so young she won't keep it. I offered to look after it." Sarah, stunned that someone would judge her capability that way, was enraged. She began to keep track of moments when Vivian promised support publicly and undermined it privately. Next, I made sure that people with authority quietly saw things. I emailed my father-in-law's business manager, a man who had always admired direct service, and casually mentioned I'd been asked to sign some paperwork that sounded redundant. He called me back within hours. He'd been surprised to learn that a signature had been requested in the family name for a small donation, something Vivian had positioned as a family decision. He checked records. The donation was real, but signed by Vivian in a way that suggested she'd put forward the family name without consent. I let the manager make an innocent phone call. He called Ethan and said, "Vivian made a very generous donation but used family funds. Did you know?" Ethan's face when he heard that had an honesty that doesn't come from me. It came from recorded truth. He asked for receipts. Vivian gave receipts that didn't match. She flinched. She began to tell small lies about dates that contradicted her own posts. Once these inconsistencies were in a public ledger, bank statements, time-stamped emails, they became heavier than charm. Then there was the voicemail. I won't lie. Recording it felt like a theft to me, and yet the ethics of it were in the balance of self-preservation. Vivian called one night after a particularly ugly dinner. She spoke into the phone with anger simmering as if it were a pot she'd left on low. She mocked my job, my friends, and the idea that I deserved access to the household accounts. She said, and I remember the exact cadence, "You know, Lila, sometimes you don't realize how small you are until someone points it out. It's better your husband knows who the real caretakers are." I didn't answer. I let the voicemail sit like a stone. When Ethan listened to it by accident a week later, after he'd been searching for a missing invoice, he played it. The room was paper-thin that night. Words fell, resonant and ugly. He listened. He looked at me. That moment is private and sacred. It is the moment where perception shifts. My trap had not been dramatic. I had simply let everything be visible enough for the family to test, and for Ethan to hear truth without my prompting. The real collapse wasn't a scene from a soap opera. It was a quiet series of exposures, each one small, but together they formed a net strong enough to hold a woman she could no longer pretend to be. A niece spoke up at a family lunch about a charity Vivian had publicly championed but privately dismissed. A neighbor forwarded an email where Vivian had asked for favors in private that she publicly called community outreach. The business manager confronted her about the signatory discrepancies. Ethan found photographs of events where she'd been the first to complain about a relative, and then later told that relative she thought they were too sensitive. People started to gather facts like biscuits at tea. They were harmless individually, but when served together they were revealing. Vivian's reaction was not rage, but panic. For the first time, she could not rely on the practiced humor that had always deflected criticism. Her voice trembled and she made promises she had no intention of keeping. In front of the family, her pearls seemed too bright, like a costume under stage lights. She attempted to salvage her position the way hawks mend feathers, frantically without grace. Ethan listened to more voicemails, compared dates, and met with his father. He confronted Vivian in a way he had not done when the tensions were smaller. "Why did you tell Aunt Marlene she was uninvited?" he asked in a voice that was both resigned and tired. She attempted to joke. He didn't laugh. He said quietly, "This isn't about a casserole, Mom. It's about being honest." The true collapse came when Vivian cornered me in the backyard and demanded to know why I'd turned the family against her. She was hysterical, her smile gone. I could have responded with fury. You might expect that from someone who'd been wounded. Instead, I sat across from her on the patio chair and I let her speak. Her words came like beads falling off a broken string, Everything she'd said in private tumbled into the air. She accused me of slights I hadn't committed. She told me I had plotted. She revealed she'd told Ethan white lies to protect him. That confession, small as it sounded, was a rope. Ethan heard it later when she repeated it in the kitchen. People who had heard her patterns before were now listening for that rope to tighten. The family had sympathy at first. Who doesn't for a heartbreak? But sympathy can live in two places. With the one who has been wronged or with the one who caused it. When the ledger was balanced, it swung toward reality. Vivian's public persona could no longer hold. It had been built on the family's willingness to never look too closely. Once people saw the details, they couldn't unknow them. Trust is like glass. It refracts light differently once a crack runs across it. And she had cracked it. I had imagined that once the world recognized the truth, everything would fall neatly into place and I would feel a triumph that rang like an anthem. But justice's aftermath is quieter than victory songs. It is the slow returning of ordinary things. After the confrontation, the family held a meeting. Not to punish. That never felt right. I didn't want pyrotechnics. The meeting was practical. Papers to sign straight. Apologies requested where necessary. Conversations scheduled. Ethan sat with us and held my hand under the table. A small solid thing. He said he was sorry, not for being confused, but for not having noticed sooner. He said he had let love be a shield and that sometimes shields can hide what they are supposed to protect. Vivian's apology felt less like a release and more like a last defense. She apologized without the tenderness required for forgiveness. The family offered her counseling and boundaries. Boundaries were the real gift I wanted for myself. Not dramatic revenge, but the right to exist without continual small deletions. The house settled, awkward at first, like a well-rearranged room. But the most poetic piece of justice came later. And it was quiet. Vivian's social circle, the people she cultivated through small acts of charity and curated dinners, began to sense the difference between a performer and a neighbor. Invitations she once issued with confident ease dwindled. She attempted to rally allies, but once a reputation is seen for what it is, it feeds on itself. Where she had been first in line to advise on family choices, she became the person others called for a single opinion and then did not act on. Her power diminished because the family no longer granted her automatic authority. The sweetest satisfaction was not in her losing friends or in Ethan drawing a line. It was in the small human things. Neighbors who stopped deferring to her at PTA meetings. A cousin who stood up to her in public and asked a question she couldn't dodge. A grandchild who preferred my pancakes over her special recipe because mine were honest. I did not gloat. There was no scene where I marched to the town square and read a list of transgressions. Revenge lived in the recalibration. Vivian destroyed herself not because I pushed her off a stage, but because the stage's audience could no longer pretend they hadn't seen the wires. If you've ever been made to feel small in your own life, remember this. You don't have to shout to be heard. Quiet acts, patience.
If this story gave you chills, hit that like button, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, what's the most satisfying revenge you've ever seen play out?